Hello folks, hello and welcome to this little workshop about experimental plugin design in Ableton Live. I know quite a lot of you might be using Ableton Live already, producing songs, mixing and mastering your stuff, and you might even have seen some Max for Live plugins if you are using the actual full-on Ableton suite, because Max for Live plugins are only included in the full version. But I've met a lot of people who have used these plugins but don't really know what they do behind the scenes, how they work, or what can you actually do with Max for Live as a plugin platform. Well, the cool thing is that you can actually create your own plugins, your own effects, your own processing units, drum machine synthesizers, anything you can actually imagine. By using Max as a platform and without even learning how to properly code. So you don't need to understand complex languages like C++ or Java, because Max for Live is a visual programming language that allows us to just interconnect blocks visually on a canvas and make them do things. And it's pretty cool. So now let me just share my screen with you. And I'll open up Ableton. I do have a sine wave playing here. I was doing some tests before. As you can tell, this is not a live stream because unfortunately we had quite a few issues connecting Ableton with the streaming platform where you're watching this video on right now, and stuff just didn't work. So I'm recording this on Zoom, but you'll be able to see it just right now. Okay, so let's have a look what's happening here. On the left-hand side, when you're using Ableton, you usually have your audio effects that come stock with Ableton. You've got your instruments and external third-party VST plugins as well. But if you're using the full suite version of Ableton, you will find quite a few Max audio effects, and you can actually buy specific packs as separate add-on bundles, which are made by people just like you and me, and they are endorsed officially by Ableton. But today we'll look at, we'll try to create something from scratch, and I will guide you through my thought process as we do that and move along. So over here, I do have an audio clip, an audio track with a few clips that we'll just use as a sound source that we will manipulate using Max for Live. What you want to start with is by just clicking on this Max audio effect and clicking and dragging it onto your effects rack over here. I've already done it before. And you can see it opens up with this window here. It doesn't look like a functioning plugin. It doesn't look anything you'll see when using any other plugins, but we'll try to kind of customize it in a way that's applicable to our needs. So if I click this tiny icon over here, it will actually open the Max patch and we'll see what's happening inside. So at the moment, we don't even have even a graphic user interface. All we can see here is something that's called basically an object that's called plug in and plug out. What these things do, they basically tell this canvas that, okay, this is the input from the channel we're working with, and we're using these cables to connect the input to the output. And if you think about the signal chain, what's happening here, sounds get generated, they go through your effects chain, and then we can actually listen to them on the master bus. So this is basically a place where we can insert any plugins inside this, well, where we can build a plugin inside Max, and it will affect our sound just like any other equalizer, compressor, delay, or reverb you might put on here. I'll start by disconnecting these two cables, and these cables represent audio streams. So whatever we generate here by playing clips, it could be even a live microphone feed or a bass guitar connected to your interface or anything else, it will work absolutely fine. I'll connect these cables and I'll create a new object that's basically called multiplication sign tilde. You might say, well, what does it mean? Why are we doing this? How do I know what objects are, what's happening here? Well, basically what's happening here, instead of writing hardcore programming code, we can do very simple mathematical manipulations of the signal. And as long as we base our signal flow and manipulation on audio theory, and those of you who have used any synthesizers or any modular synths, or maybe even have an understanding how a delay, at least theoretically, a delay, a chorus, or a flanger works, you should be able to apply that knowledge and experiment with it and build your own weird things without understanding complex mathematics like calculus or anything like that. But what I'm doing here, basically, I'm just taking the signal that comes out of this plugin tilde object, and I'm connecting it to the leftmost inlet of this new object here. What's an inlet? An inlet is basically just one of those two dots over here that takes the signal in, and we have an outlet over here that sends the signal out of it. When we think about a signal in scientific terms, well, a waveform, any type of audio, is just a waveform that has an amplitude that goes up and down, just like air vibrates, electricity changes in the circuit, like AC current. Same like sound is represented in the digital domain as just samples that go up and down in amplitude throughout time. What we can do here, we can say, okay, let's take the output of this plugin. Basically, let's take the signal that any sample is generating that we play, and let's multiply it by a number. What happens when we multiply the signal is basically we can reduce its amplitude or we can increase its amplitude. So basically, by multiplying this incoming signal by a number, we can create a volume control. And all these values in amplitude range from -1 and 1. So we want to create let's create a dial, a live dial here. You can see there's a lot of different things I can place on my canvas, but I'm just using the dial button over here. And now this should look familiar to any Ableton user. It looks like a dial you would see when you use any other plugin. Let me just maybe zoom in a little bit so you can see things better. There we go. Yeah, now we've got our first graphic user interface object over here. And I can actually use it, and we can see it moves from 0 all the way to 127. But I don't want it to reach that high of a value. I just want to control my level so it goes from 0 to 1. What I'll do, I'll actually look at properties of this specific item we have here, and by clicking this inspector icon over here. And now if I just organize my screen a little better and scroll down, it has, you can change color, you can change name of it, you can change the way it behaves. But all I want to do here is change its range. I want it to range from 0 to 1. And I want to actually have values in between as well. So I will need to change one more thing in the options here, which will be the unit style. It's basically how those numbers are displayed in your graphic user interface. I want it to be a float. You might ask, what's a float? Well, if you think about numbers, you have integers that are just values without anything after the decimal point. So 1, 2, 3, 500, 7,000, whatever is an integer, is called an integer. But a number like 1.25, 3.72, 3.14, these are floating point values. That's the terminology that's used in coding. So I want to see what's after the decimal point, because we're only multiplying this incoming signal by values between 0 and 1. 0 means it's absolutely quiet. 1 means it's the same level it came in. So now if I connect the output of this multiplication object and I play a sample over here, so I'll just play something here. We can see that something's happening, but we can see the input metering on this actual Max plugin that we are creating at the moment, but there's nothing coming out. Well, it's because we've got our level set to 0. And let's see what happens when I start bringing it up. Aha. One more thing I need to do here. Actually, my channel is muted. There we go. And now hopefully you can hear the same sound I'm hearing here as well. So by just doing that, by taking the signal and multiplying it between with values between 0 and 1, we've already created a level control. But that's quite a useless plugin if you ask me, because we already have a level control over here, obviously. But this is just serves as an illustration that we can interface and change the signal in real time any way we want. So now let's actually create another dial, and we'll use it for something else. I'll go back over here, live dial, cool. Just to keep things tidy and organized, I'll go back to the inspector view of this first dial we've created here, and I'll rename it to level. If you have a look on the right-hand side, we can see names, and I'll just call this, well, let's call this volume. Yeah. Every good plugin has an output volume. We'll treat this as an output volume. So far, so good. What else can we do? Well, we can manipulate not only level of the incoming signal, but we can twist it and morph it in many different ways. Let's begin by morphing it while still using level control, but let's make it behave in a slightly different way. Let's talk about amplitude modulation. If I move this this dial up and down, you obviously hear a pulsating change in level. But if you do it really fast, like 10 times a second, 20 times a second, maybe 100 times a second, we're getting in this territory where the change in level becomes so rapid that it introduces different artifacts to that sound. And we might use them to our advantage as a way of manipulating sound and creating new textures we haven't heard before. To those familiar with synthesis, amplitude modulation is nothing new, and I believe quite some of you might have already played with maybe modular racks in software or hardware form as well, because I see they're becoming quite popular amongst people involved in music circles. But we'll try to replicate a simple AM modulation circuit over here, and we're not too far away from it. What we can do now, what I will do, I'll create a new object, and I'll call it cycle. How do I know what object I need to create? Well, there's a fixed amount of objects embedded inside Max. So think of it as Lego blocks. All those smart, good people at Max, when they were creating the piece of software, they built these abstractions for us so that we don't have to code things from scratch. We don't need to deal with low level programming languages. What we can do is just be familiar with the basic building blocks and then combine them in many different ways to achieve different results. But what the cycle tilde object does is basically generates a sine wave. And if you've used any synths, you should know what a sine wave is. It's just the purest tone. So we can use this as a sound generator. I'll illustrate this by just entering an argument of 440. This argument inside the object just basically dictates it to output a sine wave at a frequency of 440 hertz. And if I connect the output, I'll connect this output to this input of the multiplication sign, but I'll disconnect the signal incoming from outside of the plugin. And let's see what happens when I raise the volume up. I'm hearing a sine wave. The most boring sound ever, but we can obviously change it and manipulate it in different ways, or we can use this signal as a control value for our level. So instead of setting it to a frequency that we can actually hear, I'll set it to a frequency of 1. So it will cycle back and forth 1 time a second. We won't be able to hear it. If I were to connect it to the output, it wouldn't do anything audible, but I'll actually use this to control our level over here. Okay, so far so good. But now let's talk about the signal coming out here. What happens is that this cycle is again generating signal values from 0 to 1. and it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. Oh, actually, from -1 to 1, it goes through -1, 0, 1, -1, 0, 1, and so on and so forth. But we'll use this and control the volume slide, volume gain over here. Okay, let's connect its output straight away to this input and see what happens. Well, we actually can't do that. And you might ask, like, why? There's one difference between, well, there's two different signals. We've got audio signals that are illustrated by this green striped cable, and we have just simple control signals. Long story short, anytime you see an object with this little tilde sign, it indicates that it's working with audio signals. And anytime you see an object that doesn't have a tilde sign, it means that you're dealing with control signals. Might seem a little bit complicated, but don't overthink it. We're just kind of scratching the surface here. If you actually start using it in real life, you'll see that you pick up things quite easily. But now we'll do some experiments. Yeah, let's see what happens if I connect the output of the cycle straight to this multiplication object over here, so to the right-hand side. This is always coming through, and we'll see what happens when we multiply the input with the output of cycle 1. It sounds like a tremolo. So the volume increases, 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 decreases, and that does the same thing once a second. And a tremolo is just that. It's amplitude modulation at a very slow pace. Well, the cool thing is that we can use the second dial we created to actually change the frequency that the cycle object is operating at. So I'll take this output of the dial and connect it to the leftmost input that basically receives the frequency number for the frequency for it to be set to, and actually does it. And just to keep things a little bit under control, I will again go to the inspector view of this new dial we created, and I will rename it to, let's just call it AM, that stands for amplitude modulation. And we'll change its range from 0, let's say just from, let's change it from 1 to 100. Cool. So now we can change the frequency that the cycle object is generating the sine wave, and let's see how it sounds. I'll connect the output to our master again. Pretty cool. I'll disconnect those cables so you can hear my voice better. What was happening here? We were increasing the frequency of that sine wave generator that was turning volume of the incoming signal up and down really, really rapidly. And once we go beyond like 20 cycles a second, 40 cycles a second or so, once we starting to reach audible frequencies, we can actually hear those frequencies as well. We can actually hear them. And that's pretty cool, because now we can modulate this incoming signal in a way that changes not only in loud level, but in its additional harmonic content, because we are creating notes by modulating this signal, which is pretty interesting. Let's see what happens when I increase the amplitude modulation, the maximum modulation, to something like 3000. Do that, and I'll connect everything to the output here again. All right, so basically, the higher the frequency goes, the higher the pitch we hear, and we can start creating like very simple, basic, almost synthesized lines throughout the frequency spectrum. But it's quite inconvenient just to use your mouse and like play it in real time. Maybe there's something else we can do that to make it a little bit more interesting. Well, we can do a lot of things, but we'll start by looking at another object that's called random. What this object does, it sends out a random number in a specified range. So let's say that we want to generate a number somewhere between a 0 and 3000. So I'll input this value here. And now I'll create what's called a number box. So if you go over here, we click on the number box, you can see a number box. At the moment, it just displays 0. Well, the random value object enters outputs different values between 0 and 3000 in this instance, but it only does so when it's told. And we need to tell it to do it. So basically, what we need to do is we need to create a new object, which is basically a very simple button. So here we go, we have a button. And what a button does, it just sends out a trigger. Again, those familiar with synthesis should understand what a trigger does. It's just a pulse that dictates, well, that affects something in a specific way. But here what we're doing is we're connecting the output of this button, which is called a bang button, because it sends out a bang. That's just the terminology that we use when programming max patches. So when I click this button, I'll do it once. It will send out a pulse. It will send out what's called a bang to this random object. And then this object will get triggered and output a value between 0 and 3000. So let's see. If we click it once, it generates a single value. If we click it again, another one. Well, now we can actually take this value, connect it to the input of our amplitude modulation dial, and interface. Well, we can change this value at random at any time when we click this button over here. So I'll connect my signals back to the output again. Okay, so far so good. Still nothing too fancy here, but now it introduces a bit of randomness. Still, we need to actually physically engage with this button in order for sound to change. But there's ways to actually automate this whole process. And we'll do that by creating a new object, which is called a metro. What a metro does, it kind of acts like a click. Once you tell it to start outputting triggers, well, bangs again, like just signals to trigger something else, it does it at a given specified pace. To begin with, I'll insert an argument of 500. What it does, it basically tells the metro, once it's activated, to output a bang every 500 milliseconds. So 2 times a second, we'll get a click, a bang generated by this device. But we need to actually switch it on, and we can switch it off as well. We do that by creating a toggle. What the toggle does, it's basically when it's off, it outputs a value of 0, and when it's on, it outputs a value of 1. And I'll just illustrate that by connecting its output to a number box. So when it's on, we can see a value 1 appear here. When it's off, it sends out 0. Well, that's really convenient because the metro object, when it receives a value of 1, it starts outputting a bang every specified amount of time. And we can actually create another bang button over here to use almost as an indicator when this metro is actually working. We'll see the light flash, well, the button flash when it receives a bang from the metro. So at the moment, nothing's happening here. Let me connect the output of this toggle object over here to this metro, and let's see what happens when I actually engage it. There we go. Starts blinking 2 times a second. That's okay. That's convenient. So what can we do next? You might have guessed that we can actually connect the output of the metro to the input of the random object. And now we have a new value that's generated every 500 milliseconds. Okay, now let's see how this affects our sound. Right, gets a bit more consistent, but still kind of, we don't have a lot of control here. It just sounds weird. Next thing we can do actually is we can create a new dial, and I'll do it just here. We'll create a new dial, and we'll use this dial to actually change the tempo of this metro object, because we can slow it down or you can speed it up. That will influence what's happening over here. How often do these cycle values change? And I'll go back into the inspector view, and I'll just change its frequency, well, its range. Let's say the lowest BPM could be like 40, and the highest one will go to, we can go really mad with it and like create really weird sounds. So let's say 500. But this value it only corresponds to milliseconds if we enter it straight into this metro object as it is. We need to figure out, well, for everything to be a bit more musical, we need to figure out a way to convert BPM, so beats per minute, that you are used to seeing in your Ableton session or any other DAW. We need to convert that value to actual milliseconds. Well, we do that by using a pretty straightforward formula. And don't be afraid, there's not a lot of math here. We're not doing any fancy calculus, so you should be able to understand what the logic is behind it in just a moment. If you think about a minute, so 1 minute has 60 seconds, and 1 second has 1,000 milliseconds. How many milliseconds are there in 1 second? Well, 60 seconds multiplied by 1,000 milliseconds gives us 60,000 milliseconds. That's quite a large number. And the equation is really straightforward. I'll create a new object, and we'll say that we want to take those 60,000 milliseconds, and we want to divide them by the actual desired BPM. So we could divide 60 milliseconds by 120, well, 60,000 milliseconds by BPM of 120, and it will output us the value that the amount of time it takes, the amount of time that lasts between one click of a click to until the other, and it would equate to 500 milliseconds here. So at 500 milliseconds, if you are a 500 millisecond tick of a click track equates to a tempo of overall 120 BPM. Hope that makes sense. But we don't want to have a fixed value here in this equation. We want to be able to change this number at any point in time by using this dial. So we need to do a bit of trickery here. First, I'll just tell this object that what we're doing here is an expression. We're not gonna kind of go behind the scenes of why we need to change things too much here, but you'll see what it does. And that's the most important thing, to kind of give you an overview of Max and its power when it comes to creating plugins. Well, what we want to do, we want to calculate this expression, but instead of having a fixed value here, I want to have a variable. Variables are just like container boxes that can change their inner value. And in Max, their sign symbol is basically the $sign followed by the letter I that stands for integer. That means we only want to accept values that have no decimal points. So we'll do that, and we'll enter the value 1. We could have 15 different variables, and they could be named 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 15. But this is just the first one and the only one we'll deal with. Okay, now I'll connect the output of this dial to this expression object input. What's going to happen, basically, every time I change this number over here, it overrides whatever this $sign stands for. So at the moment internally, this is the same as 330. When I move it, it gets internally overwritten to 163 and so on. And now if I create another number box over here, we can actually see the output. And if we're at BPM of 120, we trigger signals every 500 milliseconds, and so on and so forth. So that's cool. Now we can connect this output to this metro object, to its right inlet. And how do I know? Well, when I started using Max, I had no idea what's happening. But the cool thing is that it has a really, really extensive help section. So if you click on any object, you can open up a help file that gives you context and explains how these objects work and interact. We're not going to go into all the detail here, but basically the only thing you need to know, if you right click, you see the help option, click on that, and it will show you great examples of how to use a given object in your patch. So now I'll connect the output here, and we are actually able to control the speed of this metro that controls the random object that then controls the cycle. You can see we're kind of making things a little bit more complex now, but I hope this makes sense. I wish you could ask me questions, but if you do have any questions, feel free to email me or just email me, and I'll leave my email and contact details. I'll share them at the end of this talk. Now, let's listen what's happening here. Really slow. Really fast. Okay, not too musical here, but I'm just using these very simple techniques to illustrate what can be achieved. Now let's change focus, and instead of changing amplitude of a given signal, let's first of all change its frequency response by using a filter, and then we'll use a similar idea of automating things, and we'll actually automate the filter's cutoff response. And I do believe most of you know what an equalizer is. And a filter is just an equalizer that cuts off any frequencies in the spectrum above or below its cutoff point. And there is an object, so you don't need to create like a filter from scratch. Let me just move these things to the side, and I'll disconnect the cycle from here at the moment. We'll just concentrate on this section, just the beginning again. And we don't even need this multiplication sign. So I'll move all these things to the side, and we'll come back to them in a bit. But the object I would like to use now is called a low res tilde. It's a resonant low pass filter. It has 3 inlets. The leftmost inlet, it just takes the signal as its input. So that's the input. We're taking the signal, sending it here. Now, this middle input, middle inlet, is the cutoff frequency, and we specify it in hertz. As you might know, we perceive vibrations in air between 20 cycles per second and 20,000 cycles per second. And that's what the change in difference in sound pressure, in level, air level, we perceive it as sound. And we can attenuate some frequencies that we're hearing by just using a filter. Okay, so I'll create another dial, and I shall rename it. We'll just call it filter. Filter, cool. And frequency range, I want to change it from, let's say, 100 will be as low as it goes, and the highest value, we can set it to something like, it's arbitrary. I'll set it to 8,000. So it doesn't sound too bright when we're making all these weird modulations. So we'll take this filter, and dial and connect it to this low res object. Now, if I connect the low res back to our output, Right, so we have created a very simple control for a low pass filter. What can we do next? Well, possibly we could automate it by already using all the stuff we have here on the right-hand side. So let's actually do this. I'll disconnect the output that feeds the amplitude modulation dial, and I'll connect it to the input of this filter knob. And now we are changing the cutoff frequency in real time at a specified time interval in a given range. Now, we had it set to 3000, but the filter cutoff goes all the way up to 8000 in this scenario. So we can actually change the random value here by just typing in 8000. Now it will generate values between 0 and 8000. So that's pretty cool. Okay, let's see how it sounds to give you an idea. And I'll increase the tempo, the rate at which those random numbers are generated. You get an idea. Stuff's kind of happening automatically. Okay, so far so good. What else can we do? Well, now we can actually take the output, and now basically everything's totally open to interpretation now. You can do whatever you want. I'm just trying to illustrate the very basic principles of how Max works. And now let's do some experiments. Let's try and connect this filtered output and to this the multiplication tilde assigned, and then we'll amplitude modulate the filtered signal already. And let's just see how that sounds. All right, you get the idea. And now we have a more complex way of changing the sound. First, we're filtering it in a random fashion, and then we're actually amplitude modulating it as well. But it sounds a bit all over the place. Like we don't, even though we have sort of a BPM dial over here, which I should actually rename to keep things tidy. Let's call this BPM. Now we can use that, but it doesn't really sync with the actual tempo of our main Ableton session, because you might want to have a plugin that possibly does some automatic effect processing on a given sound source, but you might want to have a bit more musical control over it. And we can achieve that by gathering information from inside Ableton and then using it inside Max. Well, basically, long story short, when you set your actual BPM in Ableton, you can access it here inside Max by using an object called plug sync tilde. What it does, it outputs quite a lot of information. So we can actually get information if the play button is pressed, if the stop button is pressed. We can get the time signature value and tempo, among some other things. But I'll just use it for tempo at the moment. There's a bit of tweakery we need to do here. But long story short, we just need to, it's always outputting values at a rapid pace. Like the tempo value is always being outputted. You need to someone control it. We only want to see the value outputted every time it is changed. So if it's 100, I don't want Ableton telling me, oh, it's 100, it's 100, it's 100, it's 100. No, I want Ableton to tell me it's 101 when it changes from 100. So what this object does, it just kind of controls the stream a little bit. So we're taking the tempo outlet here. And how do I know it's this one? Well, because I had a look at the help file. And over here, it shows us that this outlet is actually outputting tempo. And there's a lot of objects in Next. It's impossible to remember everything. So help files are helpful, as they should be. Right, okay. Now, one more thing I'll add here is actually the on-off indicator, if we're actually playing stuff or not. We can then eventually use it to control whatever we want. And so here, again, I'll create a change object connected here, and I'll add a toggle box after it. Move stuff aside. And now, if I can arrange my things a little bit here, we should see this toggle box go on and off when I engage the stop and play button. There we go. Now it's playing. When I stop, it goes off. And that means that everything's working as expected. Good stuff. Okay. Now we'll take the tempo output. And just to know what's happening behind the scenes, I'll create this number box to have a visual representation of the tempo inside Max. And now you can see things are getting a little bit messy. This line over here, the black line, indicates what will be visible inside Ableton, because every plugin has a graphical user interface. So I don't necessarily have to contain myself and just only place things here. So what I'll do, I'll try to reorganize this patch by moving things around and making them look a little bit more tidy. Okay, we'll keep those knobs, all those dials here, and then I'll take all this stuff and just make it a little bit more accessible. The cool thing is that there's like two layers to Max patches. One is the under the hood, behind the scenes, fancy routing view. The other is what's called the presentation view, where you can basically just specify which objects you want to see on screen and then hide everything else. We do that simply by clicking on the object we want to add to presentation, and we simply click add to presentation. Now I'll do the same thing to all these dials, the AM, the BPM, and the filter. And we actually want to we want to click the presentation mode, and now we can rearrange our graphic user interface any way we want. And now it looks a little bit more like an actual plugin with some controls here. So when I disengage the presentation mode, everything goes back where it belongs, but when I engage it, everything now is nice and tidy. But at the moment, we're still tweaking things around behind the hood. Okay. We had the BPM over here, and I actually want to send this BPM to this metro object, or like this BPM control. So what's going to happen now? The actual tempo will sync. Well, the tempo will dictate the tempo of the session will dictate the tempo of this metro object, and it will generate a random number every quarter note of the given BPM. Let's see what that means. If I just play something here again and connect this final multiplication sign to an output. We just need to change the tempo. Right, now it's synchronized together with our main BPM. That's pretty handy, that's pretty neat. But I had to switch on the metro object because it was off. So I wanted to switch on automatically when we start playing and switch off when we stop playing things. So that's why we have this indicator over here, and we'll use this toggle to actually toggle the metro object on and off. So now it means that we're in sync. Every time we start playing in the main Ableton timeline here, this will switch on at the same time, and then everything will be time aligned, which is not a bad thing. Okay, so moving on, I would like to do a few more things here. I would like to be able not only to just sync stuff together with the main playback, I would like to actually multiply the speed of this metro object so that we can introduce musical divisions into this effects processing in time. And there's a pretty straightforward way of doing it. If you think about the tempo, which we enter into this expression object over here, it calculates those milliseconds. Well, if I want my metro object or my effect to behave, well, to do things twice as fast, in theory, I can just enter a tempo that's twice as fast, and it will do that. Well, we can create buttons that do that for us, because you don't want to manually select specific values or enter them behind the scenes. You want to have possibly just a button in your main graphic user interface that changes between a quarter note division, an 8th division in change, or a 16th note division in change. So what I'll do here, I'll create, first of all, just a simple button, a bang, that we will use as a button to change the division. And now we need to figure out a way how to do that. Well, we can do that by creating an object that's called int. It stands for integer. What it does, it's basically a container. It saves its input. What we can do here, we can take the output of this numeric value box, which is the BPM, and we'll just record this value into this box. So when there's a change over here, whatever value we have, 100 in this instance, it gets sent and saved into this container. And that's it, it just sits there. The value just sits there, nothing else is happening. Okay, but then we have the left inlet. When we send the bang to it, it actually looks at what's sitting inside and outputs it from here. That's really cool. And I'll illustrate that by connecting a number box after it. So if this value is 170 and I click the button, we output 170. If this is set back again to 100, I click this button, now this value is 100. So far, so good. So we have a copy of this original tempo we had here before, but we want to do something with it. I want to create a division that's twice as fast as a quarter note. So we'll take this value of the integer and we'll actually multiply it by 2. When I create this multiplication symbol and I send the value into its left inlet, whatever value I'm sending will get multiplied by 2. And let's just have a quick look to make sure it's actually working fine. So if we have 130 and we multiply it by 2, we have 260. So double the BPM, double the speed, the faster the perceived time division will be. And let's take all these things we had here and duplicate them a few times. So I'll change this to like maybe 3, multiply this by 3. Instead of just 2, we'll multiply you by maybe 4. And I'm running out of space, so I might just move those things down here. And let's create another copy. Let's go multiply this by like 16 or so. And you'll see what these things do once we interconnect everything together. Now we need to replicate the same patching over here. The cool thing is that if you create one thing that does something, you can copy paste it a million times and then just tweak a few values and you have a million different things happening that you can use and interconnect in different ways without doing the same thing from scratch. So that's convenient. Right. What's going to happen, every time we click one of these time divisions, it will look at the BPM that's already set up, that's saved in this int box, and it will multiply it by a given value and then send it to this dial here. So that's cool. We'll connect outputs of all these multiplication boxes to inputs of this BPM control. Now, spaghetti all over the place. That's the joy of visual programming. Like the more things you put on screen, the messier it gets. So it's really important to tidy things up. I usually like to work for an hour or two, and when it gets like really messy, organize everything, make sure it's all nicely laid out, then work again. There's more advanced ways you can organize your patch. You can have a patch inside the patch. You can like hide things by, we're just scratching the surface here. Okay, so now we've got amplitude, modulation, and everything else connected here. We've got BPM that's synced to our main tempo, and we've got these buttons here. Let's now actually see what they do. We might need to just increase, yeah, just to troubleshoot things. Let's check what's the maximum multiplication. Okay, maximum values here are quite fast, and we had set the limit of this BPM dial to 500. So what I'll do, I'll just change the maximum value that this BPM dial can be set to something ridiculous, like 5,000 maybe. Because we're not using it for like precise control, we're using it to make some weird noises here, right? And now everything else should be cool. Okay, let's make some noise and see what's happening here. I'll connect the output to the input. And let me just stop and resync everything from scratch. Kind of mental, but it gives us much more significant control now. So we can really cancel. We can change the way it behaves. What's going on here? Cancel. No. Right. Okay. But I hope you get the idea. We can multiply signals coming in. We can multiply values coming in and interconnect them in weird ways. Before we close, I would like to maybe simplify this whole patch here. And let's use just the filter and see if there's how the sonic thing, how it affects sonically without all the amplitude modulation stuff. I'll play this. And I'll change this random value to what, 1500 or so. And I'll change this filter value as well. Just for a second. It's all about fine-tuning things here. It doesn't sound too musical, but I'm kind of illustrating the working fundamentals, the working principles behind everything here. And by experimenting and making all these kind of weird interconnections based on a bit of logic and a bit of just fun, we can start fine-tuning all these values, the amount of modulation, the amount of change in sound, and try to kind of make it a bit more usable in a real-life scenario. So let's see if we increase the filter over here. How does it sound then? Right, now let's do a few more quick changes here. Let's connect that output of the random object to the cycle here as well and see what's happening here. If we add a click next to it, I'm changing the sample that we're sending to this object. Some Pretty mental, but you get the idea. And as I've mentioned before, we're just scratching the surface. Basically, what we've done here, we took a signal. We just started by using a pot, well, a dial to control its level. And then we introduced some randomness, automated randomness, to actually control the volume. So we don't have to do it manually. And then by actually looking at the BPM of our session, we extracted the value, converted it to milliseconds, and used that value to trigger basically a click track that changes those random values at a specified period. And then those values are controlling whatever we want, basically. So that's a very quick introduction into Max MSP, well, Max for Live plugin design. There's a lot of great information online. If you go to just Google Max for Live, you'll find a lot of tutorials, a lot of interesting patches that have been built, a lot of explanations about it. But today I just wanted to share like my kind of very experimental approach, just trying to make things kind of weird. It's not fully tuned up in musical here, but if we were to spend a few more hours tweaking things, maybe copying the same circuitry and adding it in, next to it and cross-patching things, you can, it's very creative. It's technical, but once you kind of understand the basic fundamental processes behind it, it becomes really, really fun. You can spend days and months just building more and more complex things and you see what happens. And the great thing about randomizing things is that you can create something that you would never create otherwise else. So all these random elements, they're pretty cool. And I was just using a simple beat here as a sound source. You can use your voice, you can use anything you want. You can use live input as well in live performance. So just to close off, folks, yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. You can find my contacts at my webpage at vilo.fm under the contacts tab. And my email is just right here. Also, if you're interested in audio production, programming, audio stuff, or just any creative media course that we offer at SAE Institute, please feel free to go to ec.edu and explore all the courses on offer. So we do audio production, a 2-year degree. We do film, games, art and animation, music business, and web. You'll find more info just by browsing this webpage. Thank you very much for today, folks, and I hope you'll have a wonderful evening and weekend, and stay safe. Mm-hmm.